Morning all, and we're up to Detroit. So we're up to an original six team, and there's a lot of information on the board, so there's a lot for me to get to. And then there didn't end up being as many trades as I'd anticipated, but still, there's a healthy number of pretty important trades that have happened with the Detroit Red Wings since 1967. I did not go all the way back to the very start because I'd still be working on the board. Your all-time leading scorers, no surprise here. Gordie Howe leads the list, 786 goals, 1,023 assists, 1,809 points. It's an insane total, isn't it? Then you got Steve Yzerman, 692 goals, 1,063 assists, 1,755 points. He, of course, retired 54 points shy of Gordie Howe, but by the time Yzerman retired, his knees were done. Alex Delvecchio, 456 goals, 825 assists, 1,281 points. Nick Lidstrom, 264 goals, 878 assists, 1,142 points. Henrik Zetterberg, 337 goals, 623 assists, 960 points. Sergei Fedorov, 400 goals, 554 assists, 954 points. Pavel Datsyuk, 314 goals, 604 assists, 918 points. Norm Allman, 324 goals, 434 assists for 758 points. Ted Lindsay, 335 goals, 395 assists, 393 assists, I should say, 728 points. And Brendan Shanahan. And what's surprising with Brendan Shanahan is just how long he's a member of the Red Wings, because when he went to the Red Wings, he was already a veteran presence. 309 goals, 324 assists, 633 points for Brendan Shanahan. Your wins leaders, Terry Sawchuk, 350, Chris Osgood, 317, Jimmy Howard, 244, Harry Lumley, 163, and Roger Crozier with 131. Who was the winningest coach? Mike Babcock, 458, Jack Adams, 413, Scotty Bowman, 410, Sid Abel, 340, Tommy Ivan with 262 rounds out your top five. Retired numbers. Number 7's retired. That's Ted Lindsay. Number 9, that's Gordie Howe. Number 1's Terry Sawchuk. Number 5, Nick Lidstrom. Number 10, Alex Delvecchio. Number 12, Sid Abel. And number 19, their current general manager, Stevie Y. Steve Yzerman. The team was originally owned by Percy Lesueur, who bought the team from Victoria, brought it to the NHL, the Victoria Cougars. So they were the Detroit Cougars until 1930 when they became the Falcons. Then James Norris buys the team in 1932, and that's when you start seeing the Red Wing. So Cougars, Falcons, and then finally Red Wings. All very quickly, but 1932, the Red Wings, and that's their name until now. It'd be weird if they were the Detroit Falcons. That's the one in the middle that just I'm not a fan of that one. Cups, they have 11. 11 Stanley Cups for this franchise overall. President's trophies, they've won 6. It's noteworthy because they've won 6, and that is the number one total in the league. They've been in the playoffs 64 out of 93 seasons, and from 1967 to 1983, they only made the playoffs twice. So what we're going through now, where they're going through a rebuild, it is nowhere near as painful as what we went through from 67 to 83. When the team was a disaster, attendance, and nobody wanted to play there. It was just a disaster where you trade out a face of the franchise like Marcel Dion, and the guys you get back who aren't worth trading Marcel Dion for are kind of like, I don't think I want to play in Detroit. And that's kind of what happened. Just imagine that now. If guys got traded and they go, yeah, that team that just traded for me. So we're not talking no trade clause or no movement. But guys get traded and they go, I'm not playing for that team because I don't want to go there. It's a rough situation. Captains, this is a long list. So if you're following along at home, yeah, it's a long list. Art Duncan, 1926-1927. Reg Noble, 1927 to 1930. George Hay, 1930 to 31. Carson Cooper, 1931-32. Larry Ori, or Ori, I should say, 1932 to 33. Herbie Lewis, 1933 to 34. Ebby Goodfellow, 1934 to 35 and 38 to 42. Doug Young, 1935-38. Sid Howe, 1941-42. Sid Abel, 1942-43 and 45-52. Mud Brunetto, 1943-44. Flash Hollett, 1943-46. Ted Lindsay, 1952-56. Red Kelly, 1956-58. There's Gordie Howe, 1958-1962. Alex Delvecchio, 1962-74. And in 73-74, there were 5 other captains, including a guy who's actually on the list here later on. 1974-75 was Marcel Dion prior to the trade. 1975-77, Danny Grant. 1975-76, Terry Harper. Dennis Polinich, 1976-77, Dan Maloney. 1977-78, Dennis Hextall, 1977-79. Paul Woods, 1978-79. Nick Lebet was one of the 73-74 alternate captains and was captain 78-79 along with Paul Woods and Dennis Hextall. Dale McCourt, 79-80. Errol Thompson, 1980-81. Reed Larson, 80-82. Danny Gare, 81-86. And then Steve Yzerman, thank God for Steve Yzerman, 1986 through 2006. Nick Lidstrom, 2006 to 2012. And Henrik Zetterberg, 2012 to 2018, when he was forced to leave the game. So it's a long list, but the most noticeable thing with Detroit is once you get Yzerman in there as captain, everything settles down. And the team's identity settles, and they became a winning team pretty quick after that. So, top 10 picks. It's a list here that is rather lengthy as well. 1963, Pete Mahovlich at number 2. And what's interesting about this, of course, is Pete Mahovlich had a pretty solid career, and this is before the draft was considered important, and they get him at number 2. Number 8, Bill Cosburn. 1964, they draft first, Claude Gauthier. Number 7, Brian Watts, I should say. Bill Watts is a wrestling promoter. A little bit of a slip there. 1965, George Forgy is drafted at 3. Bob Birdsell, number 8. 1966, Steve Atkinson's drafted 6th overall. 1967, Ron Barkwell is drafted at 9th. 1969, Jim Rutherford is drafted 10th. And we know Jim Rutherford is a GM, and we've known him as a GM for so long, it's hard to forget he was a National Hockey League goaltender. 1971, number 2, Marcel Dion, who should have been the face of this franchise all the way through the 80s, but what are you going to do? 1974, Bill Lougheed is drafted at 9th. 1975, they draft Rick LaPointe 5th. 1976, they draft Fred Williams 4th. 1977, they draft number 1 overall, and it's Dale McCourt. McCourt didn't have a poor career, it was just a short career. So his overall points per game, his stats, pretty good. Just he wasn't in the league for a very, very long time for a number 1 draft pick. 1978, drafting 9th overall, they draft Willie Huber. 1979, drafting 3rd, Mike Foligno goes 3rd. 1983, drafting 4th, they draft Steve Yzerman. 1984, drafting 7th, it's Sean Burr. 1985, drafting 8th, it's Brent Fedek. 1986, number 1 draft pick, Joe Murphy. 1990, drafting 3rd, Keith Primo. 1991, drafting 10th, it is Martin Lapointe. 2017, drafting 9th, it's Michael Rasmussen. 2018, drafting 6th, Philip Zadina. And of course, the draft we just had, in 2019, drafting 6th, they draft Moritz Seider. So, there's a lot there. They've had the number 1 draft pick a few times. Joe Murphy was kind of a flop. Dale McCourt had a couple of pretty good years in there. And just in general, the draft's been kind of hit and miss with Detroit when you look at top 10 draft picks. I know there's been steals late. I could have filled the board up with steals that they got late in the draft, especially in the 90s and 2000s, but when you look at the top 10 picks, it's kind of a mixed bag. So, and again, this is why when people talk about tanking, it's like, yeah, but you got to do it right. And you can't just focus on those number 1 draft picks. You got to focus on the entire draft and on the players you're surrounding those picks with. And for Detroit, it was just a disaster throughout the late 70s, early 80s. Again, public perception played a large role in that until Jimmy Devellano came in and really settled things down, and then he passed things on to Ken Holland, and it was really pretty quiet. I know there's Detroit fans who get mad at Holland for some of the contracts he had signed with Detroit when he made his exit, but honestly, pretty solid general manager, and comparatively speaking with the 70s and early 80s, and you just see the turnover and just the number of people that wore a C on that team. It is night and day between before and after. Notable trades, and again, this is from 1967 until now. March 3rd, 1968, the Detroit Red Wings acquire Gary Unger, Pete Stemkowski, Frank Mahovlich, and Carl Brewer. Toronto acquires Norm Allman, Floyd Smith, Paul Henderson, and Doug Barry. So that is the Paul Henderson that there are many who want to see go into the Hall of Fame for that famous goal from the Summit Series. I don't think it's going to happen. I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. That being said, this is a pretty big deal. Norm Allman getting traded. He's one of their top 10 all-time scorers. June 10th, 1970, Detroit acquires Tom Webster. Buffalo acquires Roger Crozier. Crozier would go on to have a pretty good run with the Buffalo Sabres. And it's kind of surprising Detroit would trade him, but Detroit makes some surprising moves at this point. February 6, 1971, Detroit acquires Red Berenson and Tim Ecclestone. St. Louis acquires Wayne Connolly and Gary Unger. Unger, of course, would be an Iron Man for St. Louis. And Detroit, Berenson ends up getting traded back to St. Louis at some point as well. So it's a loss for Detroit on that one. June 23rd, 1975, Detroit acquires Terry Harper, Dan Maloney, and a second-round draft pick in 1976, which becomes Jim Roberts. LA acquires Bart Crashley and Marcel Dion. So there you go. And I believe it was Harper that didn't want to report to the Detroit Red Wings. I have actually got a newspaper, a hockey news newspaper, where they're talking about that and how nobody wants to go to Detroit. So this deal is made, and it kind of submarines things for Detroit going forward. Remember, this is during a period that they only make the playoffs twice between 1967 and 83. And trading out Marcel Dion, a guy who is one of the best offensive players in the National Hockey League, and getting back not enough. They didn't even get back a first-round draft pick. If this happened now, this would be the equivalent of, I'm just trying to think of somebody who's a top scorer on a bad team. And if anybody says McDavid, okay, Dion wasn't McDavid. But just imagine if a team that's near the bottom of the league trades out their top scorer, a superstar player, and the package you look at that they get back just isn't very good. It's not a great return. Just weird. July 15th, 1980, Gilles Gilbert goes to Detroit, and Rogie Vachon goes to LA. And of course, Vachon will finish out his career in LA, or at the very least, he plays in LA enough to make an impression and become their general manager later. August 21st, 1981, Detroit acquires Greg Smith, a 1982 first, which becomes Murray Craven. And Don Murdoch, Minnesota acquires a first-round draft pick in 1982, which becomes Brian Bellows. Again, poor decision-making here. Murray Craven's a good player, don't get me wrong. But Brian Bellows, if you had him on the wing for Marcel Dion and you didn't trade Dion, yeah, you're just better off. December 2nd, I should say, 1981, Detroit acquires Danny Gare, Jim Schoenfeld, Derek Smith. Buffalo acquires Mike Foligno, Dale McCourt, and Brent Peterson. And this was a trade that when it happened, I don't know. I felt like they were trading kind of the same guys for each other here, although Detroit does acquire the defenseman in Schoenfeld. But I didn't think it made either team really better. It was just sort of a trade for... It looked to me at the time like it was a trade for the sake of making a trade. But again, I was 8, so my analytical skill at the time, still honing it. But it was an odd deal. June 13th, 1983, Detroit acquires Ron Duguay, Eddie Johnstone, and Eddie Mio. The New York Rangers acquire Mike Blaisdell, Willie Huber, and Mark Osborne. This is getting rid of your top draft picks. Blaisdell, Huber, and I'm pretty sure Osborne as well. All first-round draft picks. They get back Ron Duguay, who doesn't last very long in Detroit, Eddie Johnstone and Eddie Mio. It's a weird deal, and I don't know if either team wins this trade, to be honest. But it's a weird one. And again, we're trading youth to try to get better, but the guys we get back don't really help us get to where we want to go. October 10th, 1984, the Detroit Red Wings make a huge mistake. They acquired Darryl Sittler, I should say. Philadelphia acquires Murray Craven and Joe Patterson. So remember, I said Craven was a good player, so Detroit had to ship him out of town, making everybody else look bad. And they bring in Darryl Sittler, who they're buying out not long after that. So Sittler, at the time he arrives in Detroit, he's just done. He'd gone through Toronto and Philly, and he's just done at this point. So Detroit, he doesn't last there. And Murray Craven has a pretty good run with the Philadelphia Flyers. July 29th, 1986, they trade with the Rangers again. Glenn Hanlon goes to Detroit with a 1987 third and a 1988 third. The Rangers acquire Kelly Kissio, Lane Lambert, Jim Levens, a 1988 fifth. And this is part of the trade or fill days for the New York Rangers. So this deal is interesting in that Glenn Hanlon does give Detroit some pretty good goaltending. But Kelly Kissio has a pretty good run with the Rangers as well. And again, they trade out that young player. Anyways, you could argue that either team won this deal, honestly. But for Detroit, it's just they keep throwing guys away. June 13th, 1988. This time they win this one. They win this deal. Jimmy Devellano wins this. Paul McLean is acquired from the Winnipeg Jets for Brent Ashton. And the thing is, Paul McLean doesn't last in Detroit. So I can't praise Devellano and then not say hey. And then he followed that up by just blowing it. So June 15th, 1989, a year after acquiring McLean, he trades him to St. Louis with Adam Oates in exchange for Bernie Federko and Tony McKegney. This is a desperation move. This is okay, we've got to do something. This toiling in mediocrity's got to stop. We're going to bring in a star veteran like Federko and go from there. And Federko I'm pretty sure only played 1 year before retiring with Detroit. And Adam Oates, we know what happened when Adam Oates went to St. Louis, and it's not pretty for Detroit. November 2nd, 1989, so fresh off of that mistake, Detroit acquires Jimmy Carson, Kevin McClelland, and a 1991 fifth-round pick. In exchange, the Oilers get Adam Graves, Peter Klima, Joe Murphy, and Jeff Sharples. 2/3 of those guys end up being on the kid line in 1990 that wins the Stanley Cup. That's right. This is the Stanley Cup winning season as well. And that's Murphy and Graves. And then Klima, of course, scores a key goal in the Stanley Cup final to take control of that series on their way to taking out Boston with relative ease. This trade doesn't immediately hurt Detroit. Carson plays pretty well and gives them some pretty good depth down the middle. They end up with Yzerman, Fedorov, and Carson as their top three centers, although Carson will eventually get moved out. June 20th, 1992, Detroit acquires Dino Ciccarelli from the Washington Capitals in exchange for Kevin Miller. So this is a sell job by the Capitals that they have to get rid of Ciccarelli so they don't get back a player who is of Ciccarelli's ilk, of his stature. Kevin Miller, a pretty good two-way forward, 20-goal scorer, but worth Dino Ciccarelli? Probably not, but Ciccarelli was always embroiled in controversy at this stage of his career. January 29th, 1993. So now Jimmy Carson gets moved again. This is 4 years later. Detroit acquires Paul Coffey, Sylvain Couturier, and Jim Hiller. LA acquires Jimmy Carson, Mark Potvin, and Gary Shuchuk. So basically, it's Coffey for Carson. And Paul Coffey has a pretty good run with the Detroit Red Wings. He does. Carson, on the other hand, by the time he gets to LA, he is on the downside. I believe he went to Vancouver after LA, and that's where it ended, but I'm trying to remember. I know Carson ended up in Vancouver at one point as well. Vancouver needed another center and thought they'd give it a shot. June 30th, 1993, the Detroit Red Wings steal Chris Draper from Winnipeg. Winnipeg went with future considerations. That future consideration became $1. Chris Draper, one of the best defensive forwards of the mid to late 90s, $1. That's all Detroit paid to get him. Literally. June 29th, 1994, Detroit acquires Mike Vernon from Calgary for Steve Chason. And that's a steal as well. Vernon would play a pretty pivotal role in helping Detroit get to that next level. And, of course, in fights with Patrick Roy, if you don't have Mike Vernon, you don't have the fights with Patrick Roy. October 24th, 1995, the Detroit Red Wings acquire Igor Larionov from San Jose in exchange for Ray Sheppard. This is a steal. Ray Sheppard is a goal scorer, but he's not an all-around player, and he's not the swiftest player. Igor Larionov can do everything. Igor Larionov was one of the best players I ever saw. If he had played his entire career in North America rather than spending the first decade in Russia, we would still be talking about him. I think in the same vein as guys like Trottier, Bossy, and whatnot. And he was still pretty darn good and helped Detroit win a lot. October 9th, 1996, Detroit acquires Brian Glynn and Brendan Shanahan. Hartford acquires Paul Coffey, Keith Primo in a 1997 first. You can just look over at this side of the board and say Detroit did pretty well with that. Shanahan was pretty good for them. Now, March 18th, 1997, Detroit acquires Larry Murphy from the Toronto Maple Leafs for futures. Larry Murphy's one of those cautionary tales you can kind of throw towards Leafs media and fans. Larry Murphy was booed out of town. He was done. The media claimed he was done. It was over. It was finished. He goes to Detroit, and they win a Stanley Cup. And it's months later, 1997, they're holding up the Stanley Cup, and the Leafs got nothing for him. And not only that, but he's not a passenger on this team that wins the Stanley Cup either. He's one of the driving forces behind it. It turns out being handed off for nothing kind of gets a veteran going and makes him kind of angry. So that happens there. It's a player mismanagement by Toronto there. And again, it's why when I see somebody talking about a player and like, oh, he's just crap, he's garbage, I think back to Larry Murphy and think, yeah, I've heard this before. Brisebois was one in Montreal who was kind of the same thing. And then he moved on to, I believe it was Colorado, and did well. He did pretty well. He's not a horrible defenseman, but man, Montreal crowd, every time he touched it, they'd boo him and whistle, and it's awful. March 23rd, 1999, Detroit gets Chris Chelios. Chicago gets Anders Eriksson, a 1999 first and a 2001 first. You got to hit on those firsts or else Detroit steals it. So Detroit steals it. Chelios, of course, every time he was written off, he'd magically come back from the dead, it seemed, and have an excellent season or two. And he did that as well here. June 30th, 2001, Detroit acquires Dominik Hasek in exchange for Slava Kozlov and a 2002 first going to Detroit. So Hasek, who was a huge steal for Buffalo, kind of becomes a steal for Detroit that year as well. And then, of course, he'd go to Ottawa, and then he'd end up back in Detroit. July 9th, 2001, Detroit acquires a second-round pick in 2002, which becomes Yuri Hudler, in exchange for Aaron Ward going to Carolina. So they're just dumping off Ward, and that draft pick becomes Yuri Hudler. June 22nd, 2002, they acquire a third-round pick in 2002, which becomes Valtteri Filppula, for a third-round pick the following year to Nashville, which doesn't become an NHL player. So Filppula and Hudler in the same draft. That's some good stealth trading right there. And some smart drafting as well. March 11th, 2003, Detroit acquires Matthew Schneider. LA gets Sean Avery, Maxim Kuznetsov, 2003 first and a 2004 second. The big name in this, of course, Sean Avery. Sean Avery becomes famous and infamous at the same time, partly because he's with the Kings. He's in LA, the bright lights of Los Angeles. It perfectly suits Avery, and while he was known in Detroit, he becomes really well known in LA for both good and bad reasons. He wasn't a bad player, but he's known more for the in front of Marty Brodeur than anything else, it would seem. And of course for his vlogs that he does now. He's kind of got the old man yells at cloud kind of vibe going on for parts of it, but you know, it works. June 24th, 2016, Detroit, Joe Vitale, a 2016 first, which became Cholowski, and a 2016 second. Arizona gets Pavel Datsyuk, and a 2016 first, which becomes Chychrun. So both of them get pretty good defensive prospects out of this. And Datsyuk, of course, would never play a game for Arizona. That was just trading of the contract. And the fact they switched draft picks, Arizona gets who they want, and I don't think Detroit would complain about who they got either. February 26th, 2018, Detroit gets a first-round pick in 2018, which is Joe Veleno, a second-round pick this year, and a third-round pick in 2021 in exchange for Tomas Tatar. Tatar, they needed to make a move. They did so. It helped get them out of cap hell. And honestly, Veleno and a couple of the draft picks, pretty good pickup for Tatar, who wasn't going to stay with Detroit anyways. And then Vegas, of course, ends up moving on from him and moving him to Montreal. And Pacioretty ends up going to Vegas. So that all kind of starts with this one. And last but not least, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that throughout Detroit's amazing years they had in the 50s, the production line was a big part of it. The original production line, there were 3 different production lines, but I look more at the original, which was Ted Lindsay on one side, Sid Abel in the middle, and Gordie Howe on the other. And in 1949-50, that line was 1, 2, and 3 in scoring. So the Detroit Red Wings had a tough start to their time in the NHL. James Norris comes in, settles things down. They start winning Stanley Cups and putting together some pretty good teams. Right through the 50s, they're pretty solid. And then in the late 60s, things start to fall apart. And right until the mid-80s, things look kind of dicey. But then we get into the meat of the Steve Yzerman era, and when Jimmy Devellano and then Ken Holland really keep things settled. And honestly, of the franchises in the NHL, if we were going to qualify who's the most successful, Detroit would be up there. When you look at the original 6 teams and just teams in general, Detroit would be up there as some of the most successful. Look, 11 Stanley Cups, you can't argue with that. And honestly, while I wasn't exactly their biggest fans while they were winning those Stanley Cups in the 90s and early 2000s, I can't take anything away from them, and they've had some of the best players in the National Hockey League's history play for them. So there you go. The history of the Detroit Red Wings. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, just tapping upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.